Before the Doom destroyed Valyria, the Targaryens were not the greatest dragonlords in the world. They were just the family that survived. And that means Balerion, Vhagar, and Meraxes may not have been Valyria's greatest dragons. They may have been the only pieces of the old world that ever escaped the fire. For 3 centuries, the Black Dread has been the final argument. Harrenhal proves it. The Field of Fire proves it. When Balerion takes flight, kings stop thinking like kings and start thinking like men who want to live. Black scales, black fire, a shadow long enough to swallow whole towns. The dragon that fused stone into glass and melted Harren the Black's towers like candle wax. At the Field of Fire, 11,000 of Aegon's men met 55,000 Lannister and Gardner soldiers under the open sky. 3 dragons answered. 4,000 men burned alive. 30,000 more threw down their weapons and surrendered before the flames reached them. That is what 3 Targaryen dragons did in a single afternoon. Do not let what comes next tell you Balerion was weak. Balerion was the end of a kingdom with wings. But the question is not whether Balerion was strong in Westeros. The question is what he would have been beside the monsters Valyria lost. This is the Black Dread. Subscribe if you would fly high on a sky shrieker. Let's start with the canon line nobody quotes loud enough. The Valyrian freehold was not ruled by one dragon family. It was dominated by 40 wealthy, sorcerous, dragon-riding houses that controlled hundreds of dragons between them, bound by spells, called by horns, raised in vent caverns the size of cities. And among those 40 families, the Targaryens were not the greatest. The histories say it plainly. They were far from the most powerful. Sit with that for a second. The most feared dragon dynasty in the history of Westeros was a mid-tier house in Valyria, not the strongest, not the wealthiest, not the most ancient. Just the one whose seer daughter saw the end coming 12 years early. Daenys the Dreamer was 12 years old when the visions began. The fire, the cracks, the mountains splitting open, the 14 volcanoes the Valyrians worshipped as gods, all of them screaming at once. Her father, Lord Aenar Targaryen, did the one thing the proud houses of Valyria refused to do. He believed her. He sold his estates. He moved his entire family to a barren rock in the narrow sea called Dragonstone. He brought 5 dragons with him. The other dragonlords laughed. They called it cowardice. They called Aenar a fool to abandon his lands and his standing on the visions of a half-grown girl. The Targaryens were running from a vision they couldn't even prove. 12 years later, Valyria died. Every house that had laughed at Aenar, every dragonlord older, wealthier, and more decorated than the Targaryens, burned with their dragons in a single morning when the 14 flames erupted at once. The proud stayed, the cautious fled, and history remembers the cautious because the proud were ash. So when Aegon Targaryen finally launched his conquest a century later, he was not flying with the elite of Old Valyria's bloodlines. Of the original 5 dragons Aenar saved, only one was still alive. Balerion. Vhagar and Meraxes were not Valyrian-born. They were Dragonstone-born descendants of the survivors. 3 dragons, 1 survivor, 2 children of survivors. That is what conquered Westeros. Not Valyria's greatest weapons, Valyria's leftovers. Now, leftovers does not mean weak. Leftovers means what remained after the greatest dragon empire in history burned itself out. And that is where this gets interesting, because if the Targaryens were a mid-tier house, then somewhere in the histories Valyria deliberately erased, the top-tier houses kept dragons that would humble the Black Dread. Specialized breeds, bloodlines refined for one purpose each. Sponsored by theblackdread.com. You can use the site for free, but for $1.99 a month, you get exclusive shorts and member perks, less than a gas station snack. Jump in at theblackdread.com. The white colossi, pale siege titans bred to make city walls meaningless before the first flame fell. The largest of them, Daenarion, had a wingspan estimated at 1,650 feet. more than 3 times Balerion's recorded size at the height of his power. Put him in the sky over King's Landing, and his shadow alone would cover the city from the Red Keep to the river. Balerion burned Harrenhal in a single night. A white colossus would have made Harrenhal surrender before sunset without ever opening his mouth. The Embermaws, compact, heavy-breath dragons bred for forges and urban control. Smaller, but with flames so precisely focused, they could decide which window burned and which prisoner survived long enough to confess. Maigohal, furnace tongue, 360 feet of refined cruelty, with the hottest non-divine flame ever recorded in the breeding ledgers. The Stormclaws, agile crosswind specialists bred to fight in weather that would shatter a normal dragon's wings. Vhagar, who fought through the storm over Shipbreaker Bay and tore Arrax apart in mid-flight, almost certainly carried Stormclaw blood, but she was a single survivor. Old Valyria had entire bloodlines of thunder. The Wave Runners, sea-lane dragons of House Baeleris, bred for ocean warfare and exploration. Terax Chartbreaker is the one who carried Jaenara Baeleris deeper into Sothorios than any rider before or since. Balerion was built to make kings kneel. Wave Runners were built to make oceans obey. And the Sky Shriekers, high-altitude scouts that could see an army 3 days before it arrived. The most dangerous dragon in any empire is not always the largest. Sometimes it is the one that decides where the war happens before anyone below knows there is a war. 5 specialized breeds, 40 families, hundreds of dragons. And here is the canon detail that ends the conversation. When Prince Garin of the Rhoynar defeated a Valyrian army and killed 2 dragons in open battle, Valyria's response was not 3 dragons, not 5, not 10, 300. 300 dragons answered the Rhoynar, captured Garin, burned the armies, and ended a civilization that had stood for thousands of years. The Field of Fire used 3 dragons, and is still the most famous battle in Westerosi history. Old Valyria, in a single retaliation, used 100 times more. That is the world the Targaryens fled. That is the world Balerion came from. And the Doom did not just kill Valyria. It killed the measuring stick. It buried the breeding ledgers. It melted the bones. It silenced the records of every dragon larger, fiercer, or older than the ones the Targaryens happened to bring west. After Valyria fell, Balerion became the biggest thing anyone in the world could compare anything else to. Not because he was the apex, because he was the only one left big enough to remember. In the end, the Targaryens did have the strongest dragons in Westeros. That part is true. The question is whether those dragons were the strongest dragons Valyria ever produced, and the answer may be no. Balerion was not weak. Vhagar was not ordinary. Meraxes was not small. They were survivors of a dead world. And dead worlds always leave behind a dangerous question. What burned in Valyria? That was even worse than them. I'm your maester at the Black Dread. The bones remember.